You're now watching Way Back Wednesday, sponsored by Davenport Auto Park, the ride of your life. And also sponsored by Flores Glass, serving the area since 1977 with residential and commercial work.
Well, good evening, friends, and welcome to another episode of Way Back Wednesday. I'm Randy Adcock. So glad you could be with us tonight. If you've been following the show the last couple of weeks or so, we've been talking about Ms. May Woods Bell. And, I went to see her before last week's show, had a nice little visit with her. And I had hoped to get back to see her again this week, and I honestly was just too busy with work and did not get a chance to get by there. And the primary reason I wanted to go see her was two things. Number one, I wanted to find out when they got married, her and her husband got married, and number two, I was kind of hoping to get some idea about her parents' names, her mother and father. And so, as I said, I didn't get a chance to get by to see Miss Bell this past week. I certainly intend to go by and see her again in the very near future, though. But what I did do, I got lucky and I stumbled across a wedding announcement. And I've started reading this last week, and I've kind of added a bit to it. So we're not going to spend a lot of time tonight on Miss May Woods Bell, but I just wanted to kind of share a couple things with you. As I said last week, we had her birthday. We knew she was born July 9th, 1918. She was born in England. I was thinking about that today. In fact, this was just a very short time after the Titanic sank, and in this time frame, transatlantic travel was only available from ships. I mean, there were no planes flying back and forth. So that would have been a scary undertaking. It's a few years after the Titanic had sunk, and that was obviously a global news event. Everyone around the world who traveled at all knew about the Titanic sinking. But sometime after 1918, because May had told me that she was a very young child when they left England, and she didn't remember anything about living in England. But she was born in 1918. Certainly sometime after that, by 1920, I'm guessing, they had come across the Atlantic and had settled in Canada, and that's where they were living when she was a small child. And later years, they moved around the country, literally all over the place. She was raised in New Mexico, I found out this week. And at the time she got married, she was actually living in Beverly Hills, California, believe it or not. And when I read that, my first thought was a Beverly Hillbilly. I don't know why, but that's the first thing came to my mind when I read that she had been living in Beverly Hills at the time she got married. But I do have her parents' name. Her mother was Lydia Banks Woods. And by the way, Lydia is May's first name. Her name is Lydia May Woods Bell. But her mother's name was Lydia Banks Woods, and her father was named Ralph O. Woods. And as I said, her parents I had initially thought perhaps that they were from the United States and went to England, and while they were there, May was born, but she told me no, they were actually English. They were from England. And so I guess, as in search of a better opportunity for their family, they left England sometime in the early 1920s, I'm guessing, and came to Canada, as I said, and eventually made their way to the United States. We knew May Woods' husband's name was Albert Dunstan Bell. I mentioned that on last week's show. But I found out they were married June 25th of 1941 in Hollywood, California. Sadly, they divorced about not quite 21 years later to be exact. And in the December of 1962, December 13th issue of the Nashville Graphic, the newspaper from Nashville, North Carolina, the Nashville Graphic had the announcement of their divorce. And that appeared December 13, 1962. So a little over 20, 21 years or so they were married, and they went their separate ways. And so May obviously never remarried. I'm not sure about her husband. I really didn't try to do any more research on him. I was more interested in May's family, and I may, for a future show, just try to see how far I can dig back into her mother and father's ancestry in England. I think it might be something interesting to look at. But anyway, that's all we've got tonight on Maywood's Belle. But I promise more in the future to come, so stay tuned. Tonight's show we're going to do something a little bit different. If you're regular watching the show, you know that we've talked certainly about Rocky Mountain history and continue to do so week after week. We've talked about Nashville and Tarboro, little communities around the area. Earlier this week, I was actually online on Facebook. I'm on Facebook about every day, several times a day, in fact, sometimes. And I ran across a Facebook page. I'm not sure how long it had been up, but I just ran across it earlier this week. And it was a tribute to Scotland Neck, of all places. And the gentleman who put it up is a guy named Doug Pickett, or Douglas Pickett. Some of you may know Doug. He actually went to school here in Rocky Mount, played music. He was a school teacher. I feel like he and I probably, at some point, our paths have crossed. I think he's a little older than I am, and I don't honestly recall ever meeting him in person, but somehow we became friends on Facebook. I guess it was a mutual affection for history and all things historical. But Doug put together a really neat page on some Scotland Neck history. And so I really enjoyed going through that page and looking at the pictures that were there and reading some of the history of Scotland Neck. Like most people, when I heard of Scotland Neck in the past, the very first thought I had was, oh yeah, that's where they park in the middle of the street. And so, that's ironic that a city or a town would come to be known by where they park their cars. But I did a little research on that tonight too, and I stumbled across an article, and I wish I'd have printed the article and brought it with me, but I forgot to do that. But it made mention, and this would have been sometime, probably in the early 1900s. By the way, real quick, let me just give you a couple of numbers here. Scotland Neck was actually settled by a bunch of Scottish Highlanders who settled over in this part of the country in 1722. And they settled in an area at that time referred to as the neck of the Roanoke River. So these were Scottish people who came here and settled right there in the neck of the Roanoke River, and that's how the name became Scotland Neck. The town was actually incorporated in 1867, but there was actually a thriving little community there as early as 1785. So for almost 100 years before the town became actually incorporated, there was a thriving little community there in the Scotland Neck area. They got their first post office in 1797. And of course now the Sylvan Heights Bird Sanctuary is a big attraction there in Scotland Neck. I've not been myself, heard a lot of good things about it, so if you get a chance to travel over to Scotland Neck, and it's not a bad ride, 30, 40 minutes depending on the traffic, but I've heard that Bird Sanctuary is a really neat thing to visit. Scotland Neck, like a lot of small towns, has over the years kind of, I hate to say got stuck in time, but sadly that's kind of what's happened. It was a thriving little city at one time, and over the years it's kind of dwindled down. But there is a lot of history in Scotland Neck, and so I wanted to share with you tonight some pictures and some things that Doug put on his Facebook page that I was not aware of, and so we're going to get right into it. By the way, I meant to mention at the top of the show two things. Number one, I noticed as we were coming on the show tonight, we've got a new advertiser, P.L. Woolard store in Wilson. I'm not familiar with that store, and to my knowledge, they're a brand new advertiser. I've not seen them advertise with us before, but I'd like just to welcome the P.L. Woolard merchants and staff of the business over there. They're in Wilson, by the way. So if you get over that way, stop in and say hey. And the second thing, I try to do this on a regular basis. I don't always do it, but today is Wednesday, November the 2nd, 2022. So if you're watching us on Wednesday night, November the 2nd, you're watching the live show. We do replay on Saturday afternoon and Sunday afternoon. So if you're watching on Saturday or Sunday, you're probably watching a rerun. But tonight, Wednesday, November the 2nd, we're live. Okay. Having said that, let's jump right into it. Lee, if you would, put up item number one. This was one of the items that Doug Pickett put on his Facebook page regarding the history of Scotland Neck. And And here we go. This is just a newspaper article that appeared in the local newspaper. And at that time, Scotland Neck had their own newspaper. It was called the Commonwealth. And this article appeared in October of 1900. And it says, Dr. Early has arrived. Dr. W.W. Early came over from Orlando Tuesday and is here permanently for practice. He has rented an office under Hotel Lawrence and is arranging to be ready for work in a few days. He has just returned from Baltimore, where he went to make preparation for opening his office here. Dr. Early is remembered as a student at Vine Hill Academy here a few years ago, and his friends are glad to have him. The Commonwealth welcomes him and hopes for mutual profit to him and the community. So a couple things about this little article here that jumped out at me. Number one, I didn't know there used to be a hotel in Scotland Neck, but indeed there was, and it was called the Hotel Lawrence, at least in 1900. Like a lot of hotels, it changed hands a few times over the years. But in 1900, when Dr. W.W. Early moved to Scotland Neck from Orlando, he set up his office underneath, I'm guessing this was a basement or a downstairs office area, in the Hotel Lawrence in Scotland Neck. So how about that? Item number two, if you would, Lee Forrest. Item number two is actually a picture of that hotel. And this picture was not dated. I'm going to guess it's from 1950s. But you see it was a three-story building. And I don't know exactly, I believe this building was torn down in the 1960s. I'll show you a picture in a minute. I think it's from 1965, where there were plans underway then to demolish the hotel. But I can't say I remember this. I've been through Scotland Neck many times over the years. I actually have had customers there. And I get up that part of the country. I go to Scotland Neck and Rich Square and Hobgood. And so I've been up that area many times over the years, but I do not remember this building. But this was the hotel, and as I said, in the early 1900s. And by the way, it was built in 1898. This hotel was built in 1898, and at that time it was known as the Hotel Lawrence. I'm guessing for the gentleman who financed it or had it built or whatever. I saw it referred to as a couple other names in later years. But anyway, this was the hotel that Dr. Early set up his practice in 1900. Okay, Lee, let's go to item number three, if we could. And this is something that you rarely see here. This is actually a bond note from 1890. And you see this is the Scotland Neck Hotel Company. And it says, this certifies that Mrs. E.S. Hawkins is entitled to 6 shares of the Scotland Neck Hotel Company. So then it gets a little blurry down at the bottom, kind of hard to read down there. But I just thought it was interesting that they actually sold shares of stock to raise the money to build the hotel. And well, I guess by this time it was already built. I guess the owners were selling shares in the hotel because it was built in 1898. Well, no, this would have been 1890, so this would have been before it was built. So anyway, apparently it took them a little while to get the money together to build the hotel. All right, Lee, let's go then to item number 3, if we could. And that was number 3. I'm sorry, item number 4. Here we go. When I first saw this picture, I thought, my God, how can they get a picture of a ship and associate it with Scotland Neck? Well, 2 things. Number 1, the Rona River was right there. But more importantly, this is a picture, a painting, I should say, of the Confederate ship, the CSS, Confederate States ship, Albemarle. It was referred to as a ram ship. Its primary objective was to ram into other ships and sink them if possible, disable them in some manner. But the interesting thing about this is that the man who designed and was in charge of constructing this ship was a man by the name of Mr. P.E. Smith. He was actually the builder of this ship. And I'm not sure where the ship was built. I want to say I've read in the past about this ship. I think it was somewhere around Wilmington maybe. But Mr. P.E. Smith was actually born and raised in Scotland Neck. So one of Scotland Neck's native sons became an architect, I guess, of naval ships, and he was commissioned to build this ship for the Confederate Navy. And so in the 1860s, I don't have an exact date on this, I'm going to guess sometime 1861, 62 perhaps, But this ship was built, and Mr. P.E. Smith was the one tasked with getting it built. Item number 5, if you would, Lee, and this is actually the home place outside of Scotland Neck where Mr. P.E. Smith was born and raised. And I'm not sure of a date. I'm going to guess this picture was probably from the 1840s, 1850s perhaps, but this was the Mr. P.E. Smith home place. So again, a native son from Scotland Neck went on to become a shipbuilder, if you will, and built the CSS Albemarle for the Confederate Navy sometime in the early 1860s as part of the Civil War effort. Okay, so I mentioned earlier there were some things about Scotland Neck that I did not know. I never knew it had a hotel, number one. I never knew that there was so much rich history in a little small town, and I guess I should have known. You know, every small town has got a history, but I didn't know Scotland Neck's history went as far back as it obviously does. But there's a lot of other things about it that I found out from reading Doug Pickett's Facebook page, and one of the things that I found out was that they had a movie theater there. And this is it. It was called the Dixie. And I'm not sure when it opened, but it was in operation for about 30 years because this movie here, A Day of Fury, I looked this movie up, and this movie debuted in 1956. So this picture was taken of the Dixie Theater sometime in 1956 in Scotland Neck, and this is the earliest picture that I found of the Dixie movie theater in Scotland Neck. But I found a couple other pictures. So Lee, if you would go ahead to item number 7. This picture here is the same theater, a little better view, a little further back so you can see a little more of the building here. This appears to be from the 1970s, early 70s, I'm guessing, but you see there, Dixie Theater. And it says demolished at the bottom, but it doesn't give a date when it was demolished, and this was not the demolition, obviously, because there's up there on the marquee, there's actually a movie, it looks like it's called Nashville Girl, best I can see. So, but anyway, this was roughly in 1970. You see by the cars there, it looks to be roughly 1970s when this picture was taken. And then we've got one more, Lee, if we could, item number 8. And this was the last picture that I could find of the Dixie Theater. And this appears to be in the 1980s. So at least 25 years or better. There was an operating movie theater in Scotland Neck known as the Dixie. I didn't see any other reference to it beyond this. Doug didn't have any more pictures on his Facebook page. I looked myself for a little bit trying to find something else. I didn't spend much time on it because I wanted to show you some other pictures. But in any case, this was something I was not aware of, that Scotland Neck actually had a movie theater. In later years, they actually had a drive-in movie theater also. Not only did Scotland Neck have one, by the way, but so did Hobgood. How about that? Lee, I'll tell you what, bring it back to me. It's time for our first commercial break. When we come back from the break, we're going to show you some other pictures. You know, like most small towns, they had schools in Scotland Neck. There was a grade school and a high school, and so we got a couple pictures of the schools to show you. But as I said before, there's a lot of history about Scotland Neck. And Doug is adding to this Facebook page all the time. So if you're on Facebook and you just do a search on Scotland Neck history or Doug Pickett Scotland Neck, I'm sure you can find it fairly easily. But I had a really nice time browsing through these pictures and reading the articles that were there. So anyway, we'll take a quick break. When we come back, we'll share some more pictures from Scotland Neck and we'll take your calls. Don't go anywhere, folks. We'll be right back.
I'm Daniel Moss, owner of Cornerstone Funeral Home, and I'd like to invite you and your family to give our family an opportunity to serve you in your time of need. And we offer a full line of funeral services, everything from visitations to graveside services to cremations on site with a live crematory, as well as a banquet hall to meet the catering needs of our families that we serve. We offer catering service. We offer refreshments prior to visitations and services of our family. And we want to invite you to come and experience the difference here at Cornerstone Funeral Home.
When faced with special care needs for elderly or disabled loved ones, families want compassionate, comforting care. That's Tender Touch Home Care Services' goal, providing the level of care we would expect for our own. With over 10 years of home care excellence, Tender Touch provides an array of services that keeps your loved one at home. From personal care, light housekeeping, errands, and meal preparation, to our private duty care program, which combines all of our home care offerings in one package.
Tender Touch Home Care Services, where your needs are our concern.
And we're back. Folks, if you're just tuning in, we're talking about Scotland Neck tonight. You know, as I said earlier at the top of the show, I've been through Scotland Neck many times over the years. I've had customers there in the past, and it was always a neat little town to ride through, but I never really gave much thought that there would be some history there that would be interesting. And what I have found out is that, like a lot of small towns, Scotland Neck has a very rich history that goes back literally 300 years, 1722, in fact, was when Scotland Neck was first founded by the Scottish Highlanders who came to this country and settled in that part of the state. Right there in what's called the neck of the Roanoke River. So you've got the Scottish Highlanders settling in the neck of the Roanoke River. What better name than Scotland Neck? Another interesting tidbit about Scotland Neck, there was a period of time when the postmaster, on his own initiative, decided to drop the word neck from the name. And so for a period of years, there was no Scotland Neck. It was just Scotland, North Carolina. And eventually enough folks complained about it, said, no, we're from Scotland Neck. We want to have our neck back. And so they started putting Scotland Neck as a whole phrase together again. And so I'm not sure how long that lasted. Not very long, I'm sure. I feel like it didn't last very long anyway, because from what I read, there was a bit of complaining about it. So anyway, you know, I meant to mention too at the top of the show, one of the things that always stood out to me about Scotland Neck was the fact that people park in the middle of the street. It's just a very unique parking arrangement there. And that's always been a mystery. Why did they set up parking in the middle of the street? And I think I have an idea. I stumbled across an article today, in fact. It was talking about, and I wish I had printed it off, but it was talking about the ditches on the side of the road in Scotland Neck. And apparently, you know, if you travel toward the eastern part of the state, whether it's going to the northeast or the due east or southeast, you get to a point where you start running into ditches or like canals on the side of the road. As closer you get to the coast, the more you see them. But apparently there were some pretty significant ditches on the side of the road in Scotland Neck. And so what they would do was they would build little ramps, if you will, across the ditch to get in and out of the stores. And so I guess it was more practical to build a bridge over the ditch or a ramp over the ditch for foot traffic than it would have been to try to build a ramp to support the weight of an automobile. And so with that in mind, they made the center part of the street for parking, and it's a nice wide street, of course, and so there's plenty of room for parking. There's also a law, a little known law on the books in Scotland Neck, that during the business hours, I think it's from 8 to 5 in the afternoon, or 8 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon, it's against the law to take up 2 parking places. So if your vehicle is so wide that you need 2 parking places, or if you're pulling the trailer, you can't park on Main Street, and Scotty, you've got to find somewhere off the main drag to park and then walk wherever you got to go. But anyway, a little neat bit of trivia there about parking in Scotland Neck. Okay, let's jump back into it. I mentioned before the break that there were schools there. There was a graded school and a high school. Have no idea where they were. Both, I'm sure, have been long demolished by now. But in 1932, this picture was taken of the Scotland Neck High School and Graded School. Now, to your left, and the caption has actually got it backwards because I'll show you in a minute another picture. The picture to the left, the building to the left is actually the graded school, and the building to the right is the high school. But you see the kids on the playground out there, and this picture was taken in 1932 of the graded school and the high school there in Scotland Neck. My guess is a little out from town, but again, I really don't know where it was. Not seeing any reference to a street location, but my guess is out from town somewhere. Okay, I mentioned that if you look real good, you'll notice the building to the right has 2, I guess you call them dormers, above and facing the building. And then, of course, right in the center, there's some steps, and it's kind of hard to see in this picture. But the next picture, Lee, item number 10, if you can, there you go. This is actually, someone did a beautiful sketch or drawing of the Scotland Neck High School, and this was done somewhere, I think, in the 1930s. In fact, I almost believe in the bottom, could you zoom in on that bottom right-hand, Lee? It looks like there's someone's name and a picture there. That might be 2016. I think they may have drawn this from another photograph. But it's got the artist's name in the bottom left-hand corner. This was a print someone did, obviously. But I think this was taken from a picture from the 1930s. But anyway, this was the high school, the Scotland Neck High School. And neat old building there. It's hard to tell from this picture, but it looks like it was brick. I wouldn't swear to that, but it looked like it was made of brick. Anyway, okay. Another neat thing about Scotland Neck that I found out preparing for the night show was that Scotland Neck had a train station. In fact, in the early 1900s, there was a picture taken of the, at that time, what was referred to as the ACS. I'm not sure what the ACS stood for. My first thought was Atlantic Coastline Station, whatever. I'm not sure, but around Rocky Mount, we're familiar with the ACL Railroad. But this picture, item number 11, Lee, if you would, there you go. And like I said, this was in the early 1900s. You notice there's no vehicles out here. There's one horse out there tied up next to the dock there. And this was the ACS Depot in Scotland Neck, North Carolina. Neat old picture there, and I'm really not sure where the train track was in Scotland Neck. As many have been through there, I honestly I don't recall. I think it runs parallel to Main Street, but I wouldn't bet money on that. I'm just really not sure. Okay, so anyway, I mentioned earlier about the hotel in Scotland Neck, and in 1965, this article appeared. Apparently, the decision had been made to tear down the hotel. And I'll read this real quickly. It says, pretty soon workers will begin tearing down the hotel building on Main Street, a noble structure that never fulfilled the dreams of the people who had it built back before the turn of the century. Forrest G. Sharon, who owns the property, said last week that raising would begin in the near future, although an exact starting date has not been set. No definite plans have been announced as to how the lot will be used after the building is removed. When you consider how the hotel was built, it seems like something right out of 1965. But in 1890, when the construction was completed, and I think I said earlier 1898, apparently it was 1890 according to this article, people had some of the same problems we have today. The idea behind the hotel was that it would lure in industry and new businesses to town. Some local folks who wanted to see progress in Scotland Neck got together and made plans. The following item was published in the Democrat, which was the newspaper that was in existence prior to the Scotland Neck Commonwealth. Article appeared September 19th, 1889. And it went on to say in this article, on Monday night, the citizens met and organized a stock company to build a hotel. $8,500 worth of stock already subscribed. The building will cost $10,000. Can you imagine building a 3-story building today? $10,000 wouldn't buy the windows on one floor. But anyway, it says it will be located on the corner of Main Street and Depot Street, just in front of N.B. Josie Company's store. Dr. Johnston was chairman of the meeting, and Mr. E.T. Whitehead acted as secretary. And it goes on to talk about they were selling stock to raise the money to build the building, the hotel. And it said, a friend from another part of the state who knows much of Scotland Neck writes, it is sure to pay. It will do more toward attracting capital and those seeking comfort than any single enterprise you can think of. A good hotel prepares a man to enjoy everything you present to him in the way of natural advantages. So obviously there were high hopes for this hotel. Those who invested in it felt certain it was going to bring more business, more industry, more people into Scotland Neck, and sadly it just never did. It never did do what it was thought that it could do or would do. It had a pretty good run though, from 1898 to 1990, whatever it was built, to 1965, a good 65-year run. Now, by the time this article came out in 1965, my guess is it had been vacant for some time. I don't know exactly when the last tenant was registered at the hotel in Scotland Neck. But still, I mean, a 50, 60-year run for a hotel in a small town like Scotland Neck is pretty impressive feat. Okay, I mentioned earlier that there was the Dixie movie theater there in Scotland Neck, but I was not aware that Scotland Neck also had a drive-in. And in 1952, this article appeared on your screen here, and it said, work on the new drive-in theater for Scotland Neck is progressing nicely, according to A. Fuller Sams, president of Statesville Theaters of Statesville, who was in Scotland Neck last week conferring with the surveyor. The new ultra-modern drive-in will be located on the Scotland Neck Hobgood Highway, where a suitable site has been purchased. The drive-in will be one of the latest design and have the most modern equipment. Ample restroom, eating, and drinking facilities for both colored and white will be made available. This is the theater president reported. Statesville Theaters are planning opening a similar drive-in in Goldsboro at the same time. Completion will be sometime after the first of the year was announced. I'm not exactly sure what month in 1952 this appeared. It was actually captioned in the Facebook page, this being 1952. So in any case, sometime 1953, I'm guessing, as I said, that's the first of the year. In 1953, a drive-in movie theater opened up in Scotland Neck. I don't know how long it operated. I don't know exactly where. I'm familiar with the road between Scotland Neck and Hobgood. I've been down that road a few times, but I don't recall seeing anything that lead me to believe there was ever a drive-in there. So whatever grounds it was on has been obviously used for something else over the years, and no hint of it remains that I know anything about anyway. So, but in addition to the movie theater on Main Street, the Dixie Movie Theater, and the brand new drive-in theater that was to be opened up in early 1953, there was a hamburger joint, if you will, drive-in, and it was called Doobie's, D-U-B-Y. This article appeared in 1952. Doobie's Scotland Neck. The building above is the new modern home of Doobie's Drive-In Restaurant near Scotland Neck. This is another of the specially designed commercial buildings erected by Beasley this year. If you wish to build this year, see us for commercial, farm, or residential construction. We offer you a complete planning and building service. So this building was built by this Beasley company for the Doobie's Drive-In Restaurant in Scotland Neck, North Carolina. I want to say I've seen this building. I may be wrong. I wouldn't swear to that. It just looked familiar to me. Maybe I've seen something like this or similar to this. Apparently this Beasley company built these buildings all over, so it's entirely possible that I've seen a very similar building built somewhere else instead of being in Scotland Neck. But I don't recall. This was obviously before I was born, so I can't say I ever ate there. And I don't know how long it was in existence. But in 1952, Scotland Neck had a brand new drive-in restaurant called Doobie's. How about that? Okay, 1953 brought something else to Scotland Neck. There was a need for some recreation in addition to going to the movie theater and going out to eat at Doobie's Drive-In. And so the local fire department there got together and they had a fundraiser, and they built what was referred to at that time as the Fireman's Recreation Center. Item number 15, if you would, Lee. This is the front of the building, and it says, shown here is the Fireman's Recreation Center, built with private funds of the members of the Scotland Neck Fire Department. It has become a very popular place for folks seeking a good time and is used almost nightly for skating. A number of dinner meetings also are being held here, and each Saturday night from 8 until 12, the firemen have a dance. The two engines of the Scotland Neck Fire Department are shown together with the following members of the fire department. Left to right, Duke Daniels, Colin Alsbrook, Milton Harrell, John Harrell, H.C. Alsbrook, Lewis Newsom, Chief Alton Cobb, Irving Coleman Jr., A.P. Moore, and Howard Hale. The picture was taken while a social event was going on in the center itself, and several of those taking part in it can be seen in the background through the door. So whoever knew Scotland Neck had an event center? How about that? In Rocky Mount, we thought we were big shots with our new event center. Scotland Neck had one in 1953. How about that? Okay. This next picture is one that just jumped out at me. When I first saw it, I thought, wait a minute, that's not Scotland Neck. That's May & Gorham Drugstore in Rocky Mount. But of course it's not. This was actually the Scotland Neck Bank. This picture was supposedly taken in 2014. That's what the caption read. So I need to go back up to Scotland Neck, see if I can find this building, because I don't remember seeing this building here either. But you talk about some ornate and very elaborate building construction. Lee, can you zoom in on this thing, particularly above the door? I was amazed. I kept staring at this and I thought, man, this thing looks like some kind of ornate, almost like a church almost. I mean, it's just very, very detailed. There's some really fine craftsmanship here. Around the windows, the brickwork, you can see there above that door, there you go. Just this very ornate, just very, very, very detailed. I mean, this kind of work, we've talked about this kind of construction in past shows too. In the 1930s and 40s in particular, you could see this kind of construction in buildings. Today, it's just, I guess it's too expensive, it's too much labor to involve to try to do construction like this, and so you'd never see it. But the columns and the base, just everything about this building is just, built to, number one, to be here. I'm not sure how old this building is. It looks like it was built perhaps in the late 1800s, perhaps early 1900s, but it was certainly built to last. And these kind of building techniques and construction you just don't see anymore. But it did remind me an awful lot of May & Gorham Drugstore, and of course, after seeing the writing there above the door, Scotland Neck Bank, I thought, okay, well, that makes sense. Who other than a bank and an insurance company had the money to build something like this? And so in this case, Scotland Neck put some serious money into their bank, whoever funded this thing, and it made a showpiece. So now I've got to take a trip back to Scotland Neck and take a look, see if I can find this building. I think it's still standing. This picture, as I said, was from supposedly 2014. So my guess is the building is still there in some form. So, okay. Lee, I tell you what, bring it back to me. It's time for our next commercial break. When we come back, we're going to tell you a sad story about something that happened in Scotland Neck in 1963. And, we've talked about airplane crashes around Rocky Mount and around this area many times over the years. I never knew there was one in Scotland Neck, but sadly there was. A young Marine Corps pilot lost his life. And ironically, the wreckage from that aircraft is still there, okay? Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more Way Back Wednesday.
I'm Daniel Moss, owner of Cornerstone Funeral Home, and I'd like to invite you and your family to give our family an opportunity to serve you in your time of need. And we offer a full line of funeral services, everything from visitations to graveside services to cremations on site with a live crematory, as well as a banquet hall to meet the catering needs of our families that we serve. We offer catering service. We offer refreshments prior to visitations and services of our family. And we want to invite you to come and experience the difference here at Cornerstone Funeral Home.
When faced with special care needs for elderly or disabled loved ones, families want compassionate, comforting care. That's Tender Touch Home Care Services' goal, providing the level of care we would expect for our own. With over 10 years of home care excellence, Tender Touch provides an array of services that keeps your loved one at home. From personal care, light housekeeping, errands, and meal preparation, to our private duty care program, which combines all of our home care offerings in one package.
Tender Touch Home Care Services, where your needs are our concern.
We're back. We're talking about Scotland Neck. I've said it earlier, I had no idea that Scotland Neck has such a rich history, and there was so much that went on there over the years that I never knew anything about. Much of it obviously was before my time, and Scotland Neck wasn't exactly one of the places that I visited as a child. We really didn't have much need to go to Scotland Neck, and so on the rare occasion where we would go through there, we were usually en route to somewhere else. And so I was actually pretty much a grown man before I started going to Scotland Neck with any frequency. And even then, it wasn't like it was a regular occurrence. I mean, I would go months and sometimes a year or two before I would get back up that way again. Over the last, 10 years or so, I've had the occasion to go up there for business. I've got customers, as I said earlier, in Scotland Neck and Hobgood, a little town called Lewiston, Woodville, for those of you that know that part of the country, a little bitty stopping up there. But anyway, I've been through Scotland Neck several times over the years, and I was just really fascinated to learn this history about Scotland Neck that I was not aware of. Many of you know Tommy Waters, barber, local barber here in Rocky Mount. Tommy's from Scotland Neck, and he's been cutting hair in Rocky Mount as far back as I can remember. I'm not sure when he came from Scotland Neck to Rocky Mount to cut hair. But I understand his father was a barber there in Scotland Neck, and that's what I guess got Tommy interested in cutting hair. But, sadly, the things that used to be going to Scotland Neck, used to attract people there, I guess little by little, they just kind of dwindled away. And so there's been a steady influx of folks from Scotland Neck to Rocky Mount over the years. And so there's been kind of a connection, if you will, between the two cities, between Rocky Mount and Scotland Neck. And so in 1963, the Rocky Mount Telegram did a feature story on Scotland Neck. And it's a really neat story. I had the occasion today to read the story in its entirety. And I'm not going to do that now because it's a whole page. In fact, I think it took up more than a page. But item number 17, if you would, Lee. This is just a snapshot of the front page of the Rocky Mount Telegram from December of 1963. And it was in many of you are familiar with what's called the features section of the Rocky Mount Telegram. They periodically have done these articles in the past and highlighted a city or individual or whatever. In this case, they did a feature story on Scotland Neck. And the headline says, "People are Scotland Neck's greatest asset." And they've got a picture of the church there, a picture of the post office, but they've also got a picture of Main Street. So Lee, can we get item number 17 up on the screen for our viewers? This is one of the rare photos that I've seen that actually is a pretty good, there you go. If you can zoom in on that top picture, Lee, it's kind of, for those that may not be familiar with Scott, this is, by the way, obviously at Christmas time, December 63. You see there, you got the decorations, the garland strung across Main Street there. And you can see the cars are parked there literally in the middle of the street. And as I said earlier, no one told me this, but I really think, in later years, they were able to do some grading and filling in and put in storm gutters and sewers and so forth. And so they repaired all this. But I think in the early days of Scotland Neck, I really do think there was probably some pretty deep ditches on each side of the road. And so, because I did see a reference, an article that made mention of the necessity to build walkways or ramps, if you will, over the ditches to get from the middle of the street into the stores that lined both sides of the street. And so I guess for years and years and years, they were used to parking in the middle of the street. And so when they did fix it so that you actually could park on the side of the street, they said, that's all right, we'll just keep parking in the middle of the street. And so to this day, that's where the parking is in downtown Scotland Neck, is right down the middle of the street there, as you see in that picture there. Okay, I mentioned before the break the sad story of a Marine Corps pilot from Cherry Point who was on a training mission in 1963, and I'm not sure the exact month, but this article and these pictures appeared in the Facebook page that Doug Pickett put up. And this was actually, it's deep in the swamp from what I understand, and not everyone knows how to get to the wreckage. But most of the aircraft is still there. And over the years, people have ventured to it and have found the piece of the aircraft. And so the story goes that this pilot was on a training mission and his plane developed engine troubles. And Doug Pickett, in fact, was in kindergarten on the day this happened. He remembers seeing this. He said the plane flew over and the engine was noticeably sputtering. There was black smoke coming out of it, and the pilot was struggling to keep the plane airborne. And to his testament, he managed to keep the plane airborne long enough to get away from civilization, if you will, And Doug says, in fact, some of the kids were motioning for him to try to land a plane on the playground field out there where they were. And of course, the pilot thought better of that and decided he was going to try to avoid, any damage to structures or certainly possible damage to or injury to people. And so he kept the plane aloft until he managed to get away from the primary downtown area or the school area of Scotland Neck. And then he ejected. The plane, of course, crashed, but sadly his parachute did not open. And so they found his body sometime later hanging from the trees. The chute deployed, but it did not open. And so he fell amongst the trees, and that's where they found his body. So Lee, you can go ahead through these. I was just amazed. They said the only thing that they really took was the part of the cockpit that had all the instruments. And the rest of the aircraft, they left it there. So to this day, and by the way, this is an A4 Skyhawk. It was made by Douglas Aircraft Corporation. The A4 Skyhawk has a special place in my heart because when I was in the Navy, I went through a very intensive school on how to work on A4 Skyhawks. It was part of my job training in the Navy. But the A4 Skyhawk saw extensive use in the Vietnam War. It's a tremendous little fighter, extremely quick, extremely agile, and it just got a lot of use. Believe it or not, to this day, there's still, I think, somewhere around 50 or 60 of these airplanes still flying. And they were originally built back in the late 1950s, and again, they were used all through the Vietnam War. But there are still one or two countries that are still flying A4 Skyhawks to this day. But that right there, hold that picture there, Lee. This is actually Doug Pickett. And I'm not sure how long ago this picture was taken, but his brother and someone else over the years have managed to map out a pathway back to this wreckage deep in the swamp. And the average person, Doug says, the average person could never get to this thing without being led to it. And if you were led to it and then led back out, you could never find your way back to it a second time. But a couple of folks have managed to make mental notes of landmarks and different things along the way to get from civilization deep into the swamp where this aircraft wreckage is still in existence. And like I say, other than the cockpit with the instruments, the whole airplane basically, and I think they got the engine. I think they got the engine in the cockpit, but the rest of it is still there. And so, it crashed in 1963. So, okay, Lee, you go ahead now. But that's Doug Pickett right there, That's what I wanted to say. That's Doug Pickett. And I'm not sure when this picture was taken. He didn't put a date on it. But you see there's I think this is coming out one of the wings. I'm not sure. The A4 had a lot of neat capabilities. It was a light attack aircraft. It could also support a number of bombs and missiles. And like I said, when I was in electronics training in the Navy, we actually trained on, we had a hangar with, I don't know, probably a dozen A4s that they had pulled the engines out. And we used them to literally train how to work on the electronics of the aircraft. And so very familiar with this airplane. And it was still flying when I was in the service many, many moons ago. And I was really shocked to find today that there's still a handful of countries, 2 or 3 I think I remember reading, that are still flying these birds. And an average squadron would have been anywhere from 4 to 6 aircraft. And so the fact that this bird is still airworthy after all these years is a testament to how well it was designed, how well it was built, and how well they were maintained. Because that's the key with aircraft is maintenance, like an automobile. If it's maintained well and kept up, the plane can literally fly indefinitely. But this one unfortunately did not. You see that under the wing, this was neat too. Over the years, people who managed to find that aircraft deep in the swamp scratched their name into the metal or took a mark or something and scratched their name in there. But Doug made a comment on his Facebook post that he recognized several of these names, people that were from Scotland Neck or came there with someone from Scotland Neck. But it's just, something you would not think that there would be this much of an aircraft left after a wreckage. But I guess it was such a remote area and so deep in the swamp that it just was not practical to try to get what was left of the airplane out. And so they left it. And so it's still there to this day. And, my first thought, aside from the fact that it was an aircraft left after all these years, I wondered about, things like, biological hazards. Again, I think the engine was removed. I think they probably heloed that out along with the cockpit. But there's hydraulic fluid in these things and other types of fluids that I would have thought would have been considered to be a biological hazard, ecological hazard at a minimum. But in any case, I guess they deemed it was not enough of a hazard to be worth taking the time and expense to get it out. So it was left. But anyway, this happened December of 1963. And here we go. This is the story. It says, the 2nd Marine Air Wing identified today the pilot killed in the crash of his jet plane on a training flight Wednesday as Lieutenant James R. Foster, 24 years old. His widow lives at nearby Havelock. His mother is Ms. Cora Bond Foster of 2406 Piedmont, Wichita Falls, Texas. Witnesses said Foster flew away from an inhabited area after his A-4 Skyhawk became disabled from an unknown cause and parachuted only when he was over woods near Scotland Neck in northeastern North Carolina. The chute did not open, and that was the extent of the article. Now, somewhere, and I'm not sure who did this, but somewhere there's been a plaque put together with the details of this gentleman. If I had to guess, I'd say perhaps this is at Cherry Point. I don't think it's in Scotland Neck, but there's a really nice plaque, and the picture doesn't do it justice, but it's a bit of a glare. This is in loving memory of First Lieutenant John, what I say his name was, James Foster, who lost his life March 20th, 1963. It's kind of hard to read there because of the glare on it. But anyway, there you go. His airplane had cleared the populated area in the vicinity of Scotland Neck. He was born January 29, 1939 in Wichita Falls, Kansas. The irony in this is that in 1963, the United States was already obviously involved in Vietnam. Things would get much more hairy over the years there. Certainly in the 66, 7, and 8, 1966, 67, 68, Vietnam was really going gangbusters. But this young pilot was on a training mission, and it's very likely that had he survived or not had this crash, he very well could have been flying A-4 Skyhawks in Vietnam, dropping bombs and engaging in all kind of aerial combat with, if not this bird, certainly one very similar to it. But again, sadly, he was, lost his life this day. And to many who are familiar with this story, he is, and rightly so, considered a hero because he managed to keep that bird in the air long enough to clear all the populated areas. And so when he was sure that, the plane falling out of the sky would not land on anybody or any property where it could hurt anyone or cause any damage, he himself ejected. The plane, of course, did crash, and but sadly his parachute did not open, and he ended up in the trees. And there you go. That's what an A-4 Skyhawk looked like. Like this, the Marine Corps and Navy both flew these birds. When I was in training in the Navy, as I said, we had a squadron of probably 6 or 8 of these birds in a hangar they were basically surplus birds. They had the engines removed from them. And I was an avionics technician in the Navy, so we were there training on the electronic systems. And it was basically, we just used the birds to troubleshoot. The instructors would go out there and they would unplug something or cut a wire somewhere or do something that would disable or otherwise make a system, an electronic system, not function properly. And then they would send us out to troubleshoot the bird and find out where the problem was. It was interesting. We had a good time doing it. Sometimes it got a little hairy because you had to crawl all up under the dash or up under the cockpit and in all kind of crevices and holes looking for, things that might have been unplugged or wires might have been cut. But we spent a fair amount of time. I was at school for about 6 months, and a good part of the time was spent working in and around A-4 Skyhawks, troubleshooting electronic systems on them. So neat airplane, a lot of capabilities, and it was a workhorse for the Navy and the Marine Corps for many, many years. Lee, bring it back to me if you would. Folks, that's going to do it for us tonight. We've run slam out of time. Hope you learned something tonight about Scotland Neck. Maybe you got some time in the next few days, want to take a ride up. I've not been to Sylvan Heights, but I understand it's a neat place to visit. A lot of neat birds there, a lot of birds that you won't find anywhere else. And I'm not sure how much it costs to get in, but I've heard it's worth the trip to Scotland Neck just to go see the Sylvan Heights Bird Sanctuary. So that's going to do it for us tonight, folks. Have a great week. Take care of yourselves. Be kind to one another, and we'll see you next week with more Way Back Wednesday. Good night.